Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at our open educational textbook, Introduction to Ethnic Studies. We are reading The Ongoing Struggle for Ethnic Studies. It is chapter 2, and it is sections 2.1 to 2.7, maybe? 7. And 2.6 and 2.7 are just the summary, review, and the references. So this chapter gives you some of the foundations in terms of the field of ethnic studies, how it started, how it's been supported, especially here in California. I'm going to walk us through each section and give some more context about what you're reading. So 2.1 gives you the learning objectives, which are understanding the values, concepts, and the historical context of ethnic studies scholarship, identifying various ongoing activities in the field, and discussing the role of student activists in the field. The struggle for ethnic studies, we've talked a little bit about this in class. It's typically considered 4 main racial groups, and these are them. I'm highlighting them. Arab American Studies is kind of a newer field that has been talked about more recently in ethnic studies because of everything that is going on between Israel and the Palestinians. And it's important to note that the field is very interdisciplinary. I like to say transdisciplinary myself. So it breaks the restrictions that you might often have in a discipline, and it forces more mainstream disciplines to understand their colonial histories and paths in order to be better fields of study. And I think it's really important that out of all the fields that you can study in a university setting, this is one that has emerged out of the struggles and the long histories from communities of color and especially indigenous peoples. And it's all about transformation, change, inspiration, disrupting systems of power and exploitation. It's a very empowering field. And it's one of the main reasons I swapped from a more traditional field such as English into an ethnic studies field. I just really enjoyed the different ways of learning and the revolutionary aspect of it all, revolutionary and transformative. The next section gives you a kind of macro understanding of ethnic studies, and there's these 4 aspects that are talked about in terms of Tolteca from 2019. And so you're going to want to really understand these terms: indigeneity and its active roots, coloniality, dehumanization and genocide, hegemony and normalization, and then decoloniality, regeneration, and transformational resistance. And some of these terms are available to be chosen on your theory assignment, and some I might not have listed, but you could choose them. And the big one that it starts with is this notion of indigeneity and active roots, which centers indigenous experiences and their sovereignty and self-determination. And then the second one, coloniality, dehumanization, and genocide, is recognizing these historical components that still play a major impact in current day political realities. And this idea that the past still informs our present and where we're going with our future. And it is critical to question this hegemony, which a good definition is right here, refers to the systems by which violence and exploitation are maintained in regular patterns to advantage socially dominant groups and to maintain the oppression of other groups. And then they list a whole bunch. So, how do we counter hegemony? Well, one way is by naming it and then denormalizing it, or making it not normal, not the dominant structure. Um, and ethnic studies, in its own creation, is a political um, activist field of study that came into being in the late 1960s when Black students at San Francisco State were demanding more faculty to be hired that were faculty of color, and they were demanding a Black student union. So it's really always been tied to social movements, grassroots activism, and from student-led protests and student-led initiatives. So that's really important to understand. 2.3 goes into more detail about the historical roots of ethnic studies. So when you get to that page, they talk a little bit more about Native and Indigenous peoples, especially Turtle Island. And then they explain what that means, a name for North and Central American used by various indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. And it has been really about the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and using those and centering those as a form of resistance to traditional colonial education frameworks, which has been, the boarding schools for Native Americans, in which groups were forced into usually Christian run um, organizations and stripped of their culture, their language, separated often from families. And they go into some discussion about that colonial education here. And if we even go further back than that, there is, you could consider the very formation or foundation of educational spaces as being a place for white, male, land owning, often Protestant or Christian. And so groups were, from the very beginning, denied access in educational systems. And so from their very foundations, many of them were set up to be um, spaces where uh, uh, certain groups weren't included. Some of what has occurred has been legal in terms of the law. So there's some very important court cases that are talked about in this section that are about challenges. So 2.3 is a very important section to read slower, and I encourage you to watch this additional video that is part of the textbook. So one such court case that comes before um, Brown v. Board of Education is the 1947 case Mendez v. Westminster, where Sylvia Mendez brings forward a federal case against an Orange County school district about the exclusion of Mexican American students. So it's that separate but equal doctrine. So this happens before Brown v. Board, and here's that mentioned later, but nothing is done with that case until the Supreme Court decides that racial segregation in public schools needs to be outlawed nationwide. And so it gives you some history for some of the changes regarding white supremacist groups resisting the inclusion, the Little Rock, Arkansas group, in terms of uh, uh, the 9 Black students that are attending the previously all white school. Um, and some of this history you might know from history classes or whatnot. And then as you continue on, it's really trying to give you a explanation for how segregated schools weren't desegregated just because the law changed, and that in fact, within the communities of color, autonomous schools were also created. And they give you an example here about the freedom schools. And so, and there has been, this is also formations of the historically black colleges and universities. So there's been this notion of chosen separation, creating the spaces that your community needs in order to thrive and survive and excel. And that is different than a forced segregation. So you should understand the difference between that. 2.4 talks about the beginning of ethnic studies. It started, as I said, in the late 1960s, but if you're looking earlier than that, you would hear about, and this is part is really fascinating if you have never studied the history of ethnic studies. 2.4, it should really give you a foundation about our area. So some of the first people that were getting on board, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, they met at Merritt College in Oakland, and they were inspired by writings of Black radical authors, one such being Franz Fanon. And they go on to start the Black Panther Party. And at that time, this is what I was mentioning, happening at San Francisco State College and what would later become San Francisco State University, is the demand for a Black student union and activists leading this mobilization. And the administration tries to stop it, but ends up becoming one of the longest student strike. Um, the Third World Liberation Front is formed, and actually, I have a really important textbook that I just got recently that talks about the Third World Liberation movement at UC Berkeley. So this textbook is talking about San Francisco College, but these movements are happening simultaneously in our area at other colleges and universities. And even here in our own district, Contra Costa College is creating its first ethnic studies programs and classes at the same time. So this is a really great piece to read slowly and to be really proud about what happens in our area. And you can see what the result of the strike was in terms of how many more students were admitted, EOP, and then how many seats were offered for non-white students, and then the creation or the commitment to creating the School of Ethnic Studies, which is where all of these fields of studies can be accessed. And you can get master's degrees, PhD degrees in all of these areas. And San Francisco State University is a great place to go if you're interested. And then this is kind of a neat little sidebar that they included here, which is the Black Student Union demands from that strike. And then the Third World Liberation Front. And I'm going to bring that textbook that I wanted to show you to class and see. Here's the reference to what was going on at UC Berkeley at the time. So separate efforts, but very important cross kind of collaborative efforts at the same time, because when you have more colleges and universities striking, it's going to make a difference. And then here's my alma mater, UC Santa Barbara, creating the first Chicana and Chicano Studies department in 1970. And they also formed the first PhD program in the field as recently as 2003. And now UCLA has a department as well. and you can get a PhD in the field there. So the growth and expansion of ethnic studies, it's just been phenomenal since that time. It's been over 50 years. And we are lucky here in California that there are requirements to now take ethnic studies at various levels of your educational experience, including high school now. And I think that it's really important to see the scholarly associations related to the field. This is an amazing group that I belong to, the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. We call it NOX. There's also Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. This is a pretty amazing group. They have conferences and have journals that you can publish in. And it just really shows the expansion of the types of programs that are now being offered, the complexity, the depth, and depending upon where your interests lie and who you're supporting. I mean, you can get emphases in so many areas, and you can also get comparative ones. So, for instance, I could be getting a degree in Africana Studies at the same time that I'm working on Native American or Indigenous Studies. So, some of the groups associated with ethnic studies, like Black Student Unions, MECHA, which is Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanx de Aztlán. They build leadership, they empower students, they're advocates for equity and political change. They develop relationships within the communities in terms of where these kinds of organizations are. There is and then this is why actually you're in the class right now, because there is, unless you were already interested in the field, there's a general education requirement now. So a lot of people are going to be entering into the classroom space. And there's been some, not so good things happening in terms of threats against our field of study. People not understanding what critical race theory is, feeling as if ethnic studies is teaching white people to be ashamed of their histories. And so it has been hard to counter some of the intimidation or misinformation that has been going out via media. But it's really important you have opportunities to be in classes such as this and to see what it's all about. It's not about making anyone feel bad. It's about empowering actually our communities and teaching them histories and knowledge that maybe you might not get in other spaces. So that's really all I wanted to talk about regarding this textbook. You can see the conclusion of everything in terms of what you should have learned from this chapter. It's pretty concise. Here are the key terms with their definitions, and then there's some additional work that you can do related to what was discussed. Reach out if you have any other questions, and I can be best reached on Canvas, email, and then these are some of the resources in terms of where the data was pulled from. Thank you all.